Recently, many of us have been dismayed by the problems that accompanied the launch of the USA healthcare.gov website. The website, which was designed to help insurance seekers learn about the healthcare reform law and to find and compare private and public insurance options, failed dramatically during its initial launch. Blame for its failure has been ultimately laid at the feet of politicians, project managers, architects, development platforms, and the go-live timeline. Unfortunately, fiascos of this depth and magnitude often have long-term repercussions on people's lives, on services provided, and on trust in the IT community as a whole. We therefore need to seek deeper understanding of their root causes so that we can learn from our mistakes and do a much better job next time around. In most major debacles of this nature, and certainly in the case of healthcare.gov, the failure was caused by a complex interplay of problems. Any single-point remedy is therefore clearly insufficient for solving such problems or for preventing them from happening again. However, anyone following the news might agree that the crux of healthcare.gov's failure occurred at the architectural level. Consumer Reports noted that of the 9.47 million people who attempted to register at healthcare.gov during the first week of its launch, only 271,000 succeeded. The system was simply not designed to handle the massive initial influx of users. Given government access to demographics, it's actually difficult to imagine that it wasn't possible to predict usage patterns, and this does suggest that there was simply insufficient effort made to build a system that would meet the performance and availability needs of its stakeholders. Furthermore, Morgan Wright of Crowdsource Investigations reported in a hearing to the U.S. House Science, Space and Technology Committee that healthcare.gov created massive opportunities for fraud, scams, deceptive trade practices, identity theft, and more. Security solutions were seemingly slapped together in a roughshod manner instead of through the kind of systematic approach that would be expected in a high-quality software solution. Architectural failures were pervasive across the entire system, and as a result, the system underperformed in numerous ways. Within a few days of the failed launch, there were calls to fire the architect. While this demonstrated a certain understanding of the software development process, it also suggested that architects design solutions in a vacuum. As we all know, this is not the case. Architects can only consistently design and deliver correct solutions if they understand the requirements. In fact, it turns out that the requirements for healthcare.gov came in the form of many thousands of pages of legal healthcare regulations. While such business rules can be translated quite seamlessly into functional requirements, they are typically devoid of quality concerns, which could ultimately translate into architecturally significant concerns, describing qualities such as performance, security, availability, usability, etc. This is a fairly common mistake. Too often the focus is primarily on functionality, while important design constraints related to required system-level qualities are assumed rather than explicitly stated. Overspecifying design constraints in early stages of the requirements process can lead to premature and possibly inferior solutions, which are unlikely to satisfy the real need of the stakeholders. On the other hand, completely ignoring such constraints will almost definitely produce disastrous consequences. It is therefore important to elicit, analyze, and to specify quality concerns in addition to the functional ones. In practice, many software requirement specifications are almost completely devoid of quality concerns. For whatever reason, people seem to assume that everyone implicitly understands and agrees on required system qualities. However, questions such as how secure, how fast, or how reliable often remain unanswered. The healthcare.gov project serves as a chilling reminder of what happens when such questions are not adequately addressed or not fully implemented in the delivered system. While specifying quality concerns in no way guarantees that the system will satisfy them, it is clearly an important first step. There are many different approaches we could take for eliciting and then documenting such requirements. For example, we could specify requirements informally as user stories, or we could adopt structured techniques such as Tom Gilb's language approach, or we could utilize templates such as the one provided by Valerie. Here I'm going to use the Valerie approach to illustrate 4 interrelated requirements which could apply to the healthcare.gov problem. The Valerie template is referred to as a shell, and it allows the requirement to be described textually, supported by a rationale, and then specified through the fit criterion in a non-ambiguous and testable way. A more detailed explanation of the Valerie approach is provided in Robertson and Robertson's book, Mastering the Requirements Process. So the first example I provide in my column specifies a basic performance requirement about the servicing of quotes. The second specifies a usability requirement to keep the user informed of the status of his or her query. The third places constraints on the downtime of service providers. And finally, the fourth one specifies what needs to happen if a service provider is unavailable at the time of the request. Each of these requirements is specified using the shell from the Valerie template. And in each case, first of all, we provide a description of the requirement, followed by a rationale, and then define the fit criterion. So, for example, in the example of the performance requirement, the description reads that requests for quotes sent to available insurance providers must be returned quickly. The rationale is then provided that the applicant must be able to get a quote in a reasonable time, at least short enough that he or she doesn't become discouraged. And then we add a fit criterion, which is when a collaborating agency receives a request for a quote, it must return the quote within 1 minute for 99% of the requests. There are other fields that capture additional information associated with each of these requirements. And in addition to these examples, there obviously would be many more requirements which are used to contextualize these ones and to describe other kinds of qualities. For example, we might expect to see availability and performance requirements contextualized according to anticipated usage patterns. And we would also expect to see requirements specifying privacy and integrity constraints, especially because this system runs in the healthcare domain. Only once we have a fairly complete set of concerns and associated requirements is it possible to address the task of designing an architecture capable of meeting those requirements. Instead of having an ill-defined set of goals, we can then design our system against a clear understanding of its required behavior. According to Palermo, who is CEO of ClearMeasure in Austin, Texas, the architectural design of healthcare.gov was flawed from the very start. The basic architecture was designed and built around the notion that the system would forward requests for quotes from insurance seekers to external vendors in real time. However, this massive interconnectivity and the subsequent burden on the government servers caused the system to collapse. Palermo suggests that based upon experiences with other successful large-scale, high-performance systems, it would have been far better to cache information from individual vendors on the server and to generate quotes from the cached data. The real question here is whether architectural design mistakes could have been avoided if requirements had been more clearly defined and candidate architectural solutions evaluated against them. While we can't categorically answer that question, understanding architecturally significant requirements early in the process would have facilitated a feasibility analysis of the planned approach and likely unearthed its inadequacies before tens of millions of dollars had been wasted on an ill-conceived design. The Software Engineering Institute has developed several different architectural assessment techniques for exactly this purpose. For example, in the architectural trade-off assessment method, requirements are specified as quality attribute scenarios and the architecture is evaluated systematically against its ability to satisfy them. Clearly, quality concerns, such as the ones I've illustrated using the Valerie shell, drive architectural design. However, it can never be a one-way street. Sometimes alternate architectures will satisfy different requirements to different degrees, and therefore trade-offs will have to be made and requirements adjusted to reflect this. Equally clearly, writing quality-related requirements is no panacea to the problem of failed architectures. Failure can occur for numerous reasons, of which designing and building a system against an ill-defined set of requirements is just one. I'll end with a comment about the degree of formality that we need in order to specify quality concerns in different contexts. Martin Glintz explored this issue in an earlier IEEE software paper and identified various contexts that required more or less formality in the way requirements are specified. However, the sheer scope and challenges involved in the healthcare.gov project should have served as a trigger for more formality, not less, in the process. While stressful time-to-market deadlines often lead to corner cutting, smarter development teams will realize that in such projects there is little time for missteps, and that investing time in understanding requirements early in the process will pay dividends over the long run.